Hey, let me ask you this. What do you do to find rest? Think about that for a moment. I normally like to think that going on vacation is going to be restful. But you know how it is when the day finally comes and you start packing the car? I always feel a little bit like these guys in this picture here. Car overloaded, stuff hanging out everywhere, squeezing people in wherever you can fit them. And the thought goes through your mind, do I really need all of this? Vacation can end up being more work than work, right? So you'd think we'd learn our lesson about that. But what happens? A few months later, a year later, we start thinking about vacation again. And we think, well, that's what I need. I need a vacation time. Vacation's going to be restful this time. The same thing happens. Something's wrong in the way that we think about rest. And too often, we're just stubborn to change. So a couple weeks ago, we began studying a passage of Scripture in the book of Hebrews that I've summarized as good news for stubborn skeptics. And we've talked about how there's a stubborn streak in all of us. We've talked about how that can be channeled in a good way, right? It can be channeled into faithfulness. But we've also seen how stubbornness can have its own set of temptations. We talked about that last week. We can harden our heart. We can test God. We can try to go our own way. We can get frustrated and just give up. So today, we're going to see how that stubborn skepticism keeps us from finding true rest. And it's more than just sleeping in an extra hour, right? I'm glad we have that because you're all a little more perky this morning. But God offers us something better than just an extra hour of sleep. Hebrews chapter 4 is the passage we're going to be looking at. We're going to go from verse 1 through verse 16, and the passage shows us 4 ingredients of true rest. Now, I call them ingredients because they all blend together perfectly in this passage. It was kind of hard for me, honestly, to draw them out and separate them. It took me a while staring at that passage to start figuring this out. So what we have to do is step back a little bit and almost put together a recipe. We have to go back to the Old Testament, and we need to walk through some of the background before we even get into Hebrews chapter 4. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to start in the Old Testament this morning in the book of Genesis. So take a Bible and follow along with me. Genesis is right there in the beginning. And so my hope is that we can build a theology of rest this morning without putting you to sleep, right? We don't want to do that. So the first ingredient of true rest is, to state the obvious, it's stopping. Stopping. Now, how many of you have ever received a ticket for rolling through a stop sign? Confession time. How many of you have ever received a speeding ticket? Right? There's something in our hearts that doesn't like to wait. We don't like to stop. We have plans. We have things we want to do. We need to get there and get it done. And stopping or slowing down seems like such an inconvenience. But that's a sign of our stubbornness there, right? Rest requires you to stop. And we don't want to stop. So we find that idea of rest as stopping all the way back in Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. And we see there that God sets an example for us. So turn there with me. Genesis 2, verses 1 through 3. It says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done. And he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation." So we begin with that simple pattern. 6 days that God spent creating the world, and then that seventh day that he rested. And so as the passage says, that one day was different. It was unique. It was special. That's why the text says that it was holy. Now for us, we don't catch this. We don't want to stop because we like to think that the whole world depends on us, right? Now here's God. The whole world does depend on him. And yet he stops. So if God stops, you can stop. It's okay. Because the world does depend on him. But it wasn't just his example that we have to start with here in Genesis. Next, we need to move into the book of Exodus. And we see that God also commands that we rest. We find it in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. And if you want to turn over there, if you're using one of those Bibles there in the pew, you'll find it on page 61. We're looking here at the fourth commandment of the 10 commandments. And if you know the story of the book of Exodus, what happens there is Exodus tells us how God leads the Israelites out of Egypt. And remember, he led them in a fiery cloud, led them through the Red Sea, and they come to Mount Sinai, and God speaks the 10 commandments to them. They're able to hear them. And these commandments are so significant. It's one of the only times where this entire group of people hears God speak. These commandments then become the moral, the spiritual, the legal foundation of their nation. And the fourth commandment there is the commandment about the Sabbath. And here's what it says, Exodus chapter 20, verse 8. It says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates." Why? Verse 11, "For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." Now, so we're given that command to set aside a day of rest. Well, at least that was given to the Israelites originally. And the commandment, I want you to notice this, that the commandment is tied back to creation. And so I think part of the intent of that was that the Israelites were supposed to stop their activity, and that was supposed to be a reminder to them that God is their creator. Doesn't that make sense? Because the pattern starts with him. So if people continue the pattern, then it's supposed to be a very vivid reminder of what God did, that he's the one who made us. So it's a reminder that we depend upon him. We like to think we're independent, but we're not. He's our creator. Now, the same commandment is restated in Deuteronomy chapter 5. Moses reiterated the 10 Commandments to the next generation of Israelites. And it's interesting because he phrases the fourth commandment differently there. Very similar, it starts, "Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, or your male servant or your female servant, or your ox or your donkey, or any of your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates." Now this is new here. Look at this phrase. "That your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you." And then catch this, verse 15. "You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day." So here Moses makes the point that the Sabbath was supposed to remind them to allow their servants to rest. And it was supposed to remind them of how God rescued them from Egypt. So here again, the point is dependence. And the way it's stated in Exodus 20, it's depending upon God for your very existence. He's your creator. But here the point is depending upon God for your freedom, that he's the one who saves you, your savior, your rescuer. And so the principle of the Sabbath is to stop all your activity and remember God. Remember your dependence upon him. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that this commandment was given specifically to the Israelites. And I think that's an important thing to catch. because this is the only one of the Ten Commandments that isn't restated in the New Testament. There seems to be a little bit more freedom in how we think about the Sabbath in the New Testament. For example, in Colossians 2:16, Paul says this. He says, "Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink or with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath." See, the Christian church isn't a nation like Israel. In Israel, the Sabbath God designed that to be an essential part of their culture that would keep God at the center of their national identity. It was a sign of God's covenant relationship with them. But for us, in the New Testament times, the church is scattered throughout the world. We're in all different nations, places where the Sabbath isn't observed. And so people may have to work on that day. And from a New Testament perspective, I think that's okay. The principle, though, still stands. Are you willing to stop all your activity and remember your complete dependence upon God? That's the first ingredient of true rest. It's that stopping, and not just stopping for its own sake, but stopping with a purpose, stopping to reflect on God, stopping to kind of break out of our stubborn independence and remember that we really are dependent upon Him. Now, we're going to see that same Sabbath principle talked about in Hebrews chapter 4. But before we get there, we need to touch on a few more Old Testament passages. So let me show you a second ingredient of true rest. The second ingredient is what I'm calling arriving. Or the word that's used in Hebrews 4 is entering. Do you find some places more restful than others? This is my idea of a restful place, right? It's a nice, beautiful beach on a warm, sunny day. Maybe for you, it's a crisp, cool fall day in the woods. Whatever it is, we all kind of look forward to those times when we get to go to those special places, right? And that same idea, that hope of arriving at a restful place, is a part is one of those ingredients of the biblical idea of rest. The first time that comes out in the scripture is back in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 9 through 10. And it talks about looking forward to a place of safety. Now, safety is a difficult thing to find in our world, isn't it? I mean, our society keeps trying to find ways to keep us safe. Fences and razor wire and security guards and metal detectors. And yet, none of it seems to work. It seems like the more we try to set up security things, the more dangerous life gets. Well, that's not anything new. The Israelites, even back in the Old Testament, faced all kinds of security and safety concerns. And that's mentioned here in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 9 through 10. We're kind of jumping into the middle of a sentence here. But notice what it says. It says, "For you have not as yet come to the rest and to the inheritance that the Lord your God is giving you. But when you go over the Jordan and live in the land that the Lord your God is giving you to inherit, and when He gives you rest from all your enemies around, so that you live in safety," then it goes on to talk about them having a central place of worship. But notice that idea there. God had chosen Israel to establish His kingdom. He had promised to lead the Israelites to a place that He was going to give them, to this land. And part of that promise was that at some point, they would enjoy true rest there. They wouldn't have to be concerned about enemies. Now, that generation did enter the land under the leadership of Joshua. It's going to mention that in Hebrews chapter 4. But it wasn't yet a place of safety and security. In fact, we could read through the whole Old Testament and all of history up till today. And I think we'd have to say that that land is probably one of the most dangerous places on earth. Even now. And yet, the Old Testament prophets, we're not going to take the time to go there and look at all the places where they mention it, but they keep looking forward to a future time when the land would finally be a place of peace and safety. So there was this hope, this anticipation of a time when they'd be in a safe place. It's associated with a place. Now, when Hebrews 4 speaks of entering this place of rest, this place of safety and security, it draws upon another passage that we talked about last week. Psalm 95, verses 10 through 11. And I think a good way to sum up what this verse is getting at least in the way it's quoted in Hebrews 4, is that it's a place of purity. And I say that because the idea is that not everyone is able to get into it. Not everyone can enter. We find Psalm 95, verses 10 through 11. It's quoting God here, and it says, "For 40 years I loathed that generation." It's talking about the first generation who came out of Egypt. "And said, they are a people who go astray in their heart, and they have not known my ways. Therefore I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest." See, last week we talked about this first generation of Israelites. They were the first ones to receive God's promise about the land. And yet, they kept disobeying and doubting God. To the point that, remember, they ultimately refused to go into the land. Remember that story? They sent out the spies into the land, and they came back, and 10 of them said that it was going to be too difficult, that the enemies were too big. Only 2 of the spies said they could take it, Joshua and Caleb. Well, they refused to go in. And then God's going to punish them for that, and so they say, we changed our mind. We want to go into the land now. But God doesn't let them do that. He sentences them at that point to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until that whole generation dies off and there's a new generation who can enter the land. And so this Psalm 95, refers back to that event to make a point. And the point is that in God's kingdom, there won't be anyone or anything that offends God. Does that make sense? It's a place of purity. God doesn't allow that. Because, and here's the reason, there's no true rest when God is offended. There can't be. So God's kingdom will only be populated by people who are pure, who are righteous, who are holy. So let me sum up here. God's kingdom will be a place of rest because, number one, it'll be a place of safety. In other words, there's no conflict between people. And 2, because it's a place of purity. In other words, there's no conflict between people and God. Does that make sense? That's how there's rest. So you know that perfect rest that you and I envision when we get ready to go somewhere on vacation? The only place that exists is in God's kingdom. So that desire in us, in our heart, where we go, I'm going to go to this place and it's going to be perfect. That's a desire that God's given you so that you'll look ahead to his kingdom, not just to vacation. Your vacation's always going to fall short of that. But that should be our hope. We should be looking. It's okay to take a vacation. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, right? But we should look beyond vacation to God's kingdom and say that's the true rest. So let's review for a moment before we get into Hebrews 4. The ingredients of true rest are, first of all, what? Stopping to reflect on our complete dependence upon God. And that reflection will happen best in combination with that second ingredient, entering God's kingdom of perfect safety and purity. Now, with that foundation, we're ready to move into Hebrews chapter 4. And we see the third ingredient of true rest. It's believing. Believing. And in thinking about believing, I think it'll help us to picture someone giving you a ticket. You didn't pay for it. You didn't ask for it. You didn't even really know you needed it. But it's been presented to you. So what do you do with it? That's the idea. Hebrews chapter 4, verses 1 through 2 is where we want to start. And it talks about believing in God's promise. That's what a ticket is. It's a promise. Right? You have this ticket. It says it will let you in. God's promise is about entering his kingdom. And so what do you do with that ticket, that promise? You could choose to ignore it. You could choose to throw it out and say, well, I don't want to go there. Or you could say, I want to go there, but I don't really trust that this ticket's going to get me there. I'm going to find my own way there. Now that is essentially what happened with the Israelites. This is what Hebrews 4 talks about. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 1, it says, therefore, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear, lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. For good news came to us just as to them, but the message they heard did not benefit them, because they were not united by faith with those who listened. And we've talked about this idea. In the Old Testament, God promised to give the Israelites a land, and he was going to build for them a kingdom where they find that rest that their hearts long for. But that first generation didn't believe that God could do it. So in a sense, the ticket was offered to them, but they turned it down. They didn't trust his promise. They kept trying to do it their own way. And so that's what the passage says. It didn't help them at all that they got the promise because they didn't believe it. But the point here, the reason the author is talking about it is because he says, for us today, the offer still stands. There's still a promise of finding true rest in God's kingdom. Are you ready to accept that? Are you willing to trust God when he makes a promise like that? See, we find rest when we trust God right now for something he promises to give us in the future. That's the idea here. But there's more to it than that. We don't just believe in God's promise, we also believe in God's providence. When we talk about God's providence, in a sense, it's saying that we have to believe that he's with us all along the way as a loving and caring Father. Take a look at verses 3 through 5 here. It says, for we who have believed enter that rest, as he has said. Now here's that quote from Psalm 95. As I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Although his works were finished from the foundation of the world. That's taking us back to Genesis 2. For, verse 4, for he has somewhere spoken of the seventh day in this way, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again in this passage he said, they shall not enter my rest. Now, see what I mean here? This is where all these ingredients kind of get blended together, and it's hard to sort them out. But I think the emphasis that the author of Hebrews is getting at here in this section is that God's rest is not just something that's future. The author says there at the end of verse 3 that God's works were finished at the very beginning. And so what he's getting at here is that we can begin enjoying that rest right now. How does that work? I mean, the kingdom's not here. We're not in a perfect place of safety and security. There's still conflict. There's still impurity. There's all these things. But the idea here is that, God's not really worried about that. God's not concerned. Why? Because he's finished his work. He's established his plan. His plan is set. And though all of those challenges that we face along the way, no matter what comes our way, we can rest in his finished work, in his plan. The theological term for that is God's providence. That he's in control. That he's sovereign. It's trusting what Paul said back in Romans chapter 8, verse 28. Remember that verse? We know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. And so the idea is, if I know that my future is secure, I can rest in that. And I can rest in the fact that God's completed his work and that he's guiding me to that destination. I believe in God's promise, and I believe in his providence that gets me there. Now, verses 6 through 8 really drive home those ideas and impress them on us. Take a look at verse 6. It says in verse 6, "Since therefore it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly received the good news failed to enter because of disobedience, again he appoints a certain day today, saying through David so long afterward in the words already quoted, 'Today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, for if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on.'" So again, he quotes from Psalm 95, and he says, look, don't delay. God's opened up the opportunity for you to believe in God's promise. You can do that today. You still have an opportunity to enter into his kingdom. And so that he's saying, do it before it's too late. Don't harden your heart. Don't be like that generation who doubted God, who cast his promise aside and said, I don't need your ticket. I can do it on my own. Don't do that. God's promise still stands. Believe while you have the opportunity, because it won't always be there. Right? We talked about that last week. We could die. There's not another chance after you die. Jesus could come back. There's not another chance after Jesus comes back. Seize this day to believe. Believe while you have the opportunity. Now, there's one more ingredient that's needed to complete this picture of rest. And we've already touched upon it when we said that God's kingdom is a place of purity. And the fourth ingredient then is obeying. Obeying. Sticking with our illustration, if we talk about a ticket that gets you into the kingdom, somebody has to pay for the ticket, okay? And the only payment that will suffice is perfect obedience. But here's the thing. We've just been talking about believing, about trusting, about resting. So somehow we have to become obedient without works. Without my works. Hebrews chapter 4, verses 9 through 11 talks about that. It shows us the idea that somehow I need to be able to sit back and let someone else do it for me. Look at verse 9. It says, "So then, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. Let us therefore strive to enter that rest, so that no one may fall by the same sort of disobedience." So the author mentions the Sabbath here. We talked about the Sabbath commandments, right? But he doesn't speak of it as a weekly day of rest. That's not what he's getting at. Here he talks about the Sabbath as a way of life now. To live under God's rest, to live trusting God. Right? He says if we've entered God's rest, there at the end of verse 10, he says, then we've rested from our works. What does he mean, rested from our works? Well, I think he's referring to our attempts to make ourselves acceptable to God. However you might try to do that. If you try to do it by just being a good moral person, or you try to do it by being religious, or you try to do it by seeking some sort of mystical experience, none of that will ever be enough. It will always fall short. It'll amount to nothing more than disobedience. So take a seat. Enter into God's rest. Let him do it. That's the point here. Enter into his rest now. Believe in him now. Now, that's not to say that God just overlooks our sin, because we said his kingdom is a place of purity, right? And so look at where the author goes in verses 12 through 13. 12 through 13, he says we're without any excuse for not obeying. And he speaks of God's word as being like a sword. It's a powerful verse. Look at verse 12. He says there, the word of God is living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing to the division of soul and of spirit, and of joints and of marrow, and discerning the thoughts and intentions of the heart. And no creature is hidden from his sight, but all are naked and exposed to the eyes of him to whom we must give account. Those are kind of frightening verses, aren't they? I mean, there's some words there that we're not really comfortable with, like being naked, being exposed. God sees everything about us, right? We can't hide anything. And that's this picture here of the word as a sword, that it's sharp and it pierces into the inner man, right? He talks about the division of soul and of spirit. We don't even know what that means. We can't separate that. We don't know. But yet God does. He pierces it within. He looks at the thoughts and intentions of our heart. Right? When we think, oh, I'm going to do this good thing, this religious thing, and it's going to earn me some points with God. He sees the motives. He sees the thoughts behind it. Those times when we try to obey and it just flops. Maybe it looks good on the outside to everybody else, but God sees the selfish motivations, the independence, the lack of trust, the lack of faith. He sees all of that. We're laid bare to him. We're exposed. We're an open book before him. Even our best efforts of obedience are distorted. And so the idea of those verses is we have no excuse. We can't measure up. God's word destroys any stubborn sense of independence. We have to rely on his rest. Now, originally, I thought about stopping at that point. But as I looked at the passage, I'm like, well, that leaves out the best part. We have to go to the next few verses. And we're going to talk more about these verses next week, but we need to touch on them at this point. Because the only way that I can be seen as obedient so that I can enter God's kingdom is through Jesus. Verse 14, it says, since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. That's the only way that we can have rest. It's that Jesus has to represent us before God. I can't do it. I rely upon him to take away my sin through his sacrificial death on my behalf. And I rely upon him to come, and this is what the passage is really getting at, for him to present his obedience for me. So the key question is, are we still trying to earn God's acceptance through our efforts? See, that's a heavy burden. That's tiresome because you can't do it. It's impossible. And if we're too stubborn to accept that, then it's like we're taking the ticket purchased by the perfect life and sacrificial death of Jesus, and we're just throwing it away and saying, I don't need it. I don't need to trust in him. And the point is that he is our rest. Here's what Jesus said in Matthew 11. Great words. He said, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Have you done that? Have you come to him? Are you trusting him and him alone to open the way into rest, into that place of rest, into his kingdom? Now, when Jesus said that, he also added these words, verses 29 through 30. He said, take my yoke upon you. You know what a yoke is for animals, right? Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest. There's that word again. For your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So here's the thing, talking about obedience. Obedience is not a matter of us earning our way into God's kingdom. But once we've come to the place that we are truly resting in Jesus, and I know that He has taken care of that for me, then, as these verses talk about, then I can take His yoke. I can begin to serve Him, and it becomes much different. Obedience isn't something that's burdensome, that's frustrating, but it's a matter of just trusting Him and letting Him guide me through life. I can rest because when I encounter difficulties, I know what God says, how God says to respond to all the moral choices in life. I have something to guide me that shows me right from wrong. I can find rest in that. Now, you know what? I'm going to stumble in doing that. But I have to keep coming back to the idea that my rest is not in my obedience. My obedience is not the source of my rest. It's His obedience. My obedience is part of just enjoying the rest that He offers. Because I have that rest in Him, I'm going to let Him guide and direct me through life. That's the idea. So the good news for stubborn skeptics is that you can enter God's rest. At some point, God's safe, pure kingdom will come. But you don't have to earn your way into it. You don't have to work into it. You simply believe God's promise. Trust in Jesus. Trust in His obedience on your behalf. Rest in Him for your future. And then rest in Him now through whatever temptations or trials you face. Believe in God's providence. Believe that God has a plan. He's directing things, and allow Jesus to guide you through His Word. You know, there on the response card every week we put some practical responses and give you a chance to mark one of those. Now, you don't have to do that, of course. But I do want to challenge you when we go through things like this to think of some practical response, some commitment to make in your heart before God. Maybe this week, maybe it would just be that first point. It would be setting aside time to stop and reflect on God. Maybe you've never even done that before. And you need to try that. Maybe it's coming to the place of fixing your hope on God's kingdom. Because if we're hoping in anything else, it's going to disappoint us. And that drive we have to keep looking for that rest, it's pointing us to His kingdom, as we said. Maybe for you today, you need to make that first step of committing to trust God. And to say, I'm going to believe in your promise, God. I'm going to believe in your providence, your plan. Or maybe today, you need to commit yourself to obeying God, not out of a sense of, I have to measure up. Because that's not going to happen. We aren't going to measure up. Jesus did that for us. But because He offers us His truth to guide us, and we find rest now in the journey by listening to it, by following it. May God guide us into His perfect rest.